Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. We've had some technical difficulties to the start of the debate, so thank you for waiting around for this. I'd like to welcome you to the Waterloo Forum's Winter 2026 debate, where we're asking the question, is the future of Canada with Europe? My name is Jordan Bauman. I'm president of the Waterloo Forum, and the Waterloo Forum exists to bring academically rigorous debate to campus, something that is maybe lacking in these times. You can see on the screen here, we can flip to our contact info. We have an Instagram account, an email, and YouTube where we've posted our previous debates, so you can visit any of those. We have some sponsors for this evening as well, in particular WUSA, the Waterloo Undergraduate Student Association here, and the University of Waterloo's Office of Research, both of which have provided us generous grants. So our motion this evening is going to be phrased as the following. Be it resolved that the future of Canada is with Europe. So now I'd like to introduce our debaters this evening. On the proposition side, arguing in favor of the motion, is Dan Ciuriak, Senior Fellow at CG and at the C.D. Howe Institute. He's graciously joined us from Ottawa today. We also have Dr. Ken Jackson, Associate Professor of Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. And on the opposition side, we have Dr. Patricia Goff, Professor of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Dr. David Welch, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. So thank you all for joining us. Our format this evening will be simple. We'll have 3-minute opening speeches from each of our debaters. We'll then have a round of rebuttals, which will be 5 minutes each. And then we'll have a time for discussion and questions at the end. So with that said, let's get into it. We're going to start off with the proposition side. Dan Ciuriak, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters. In many ways, the decision that Canada's future is in Europe has been taken for us by the United States by turning inwards. They now have the highest tariffs since the 30s, and we have to turn outwards. When we turn outwards, the largest, closest, most trade-friendly neighbor is Europe. Twice before in its history, Canada has embraced continentalism, and in each case that embrace has been ruptured. The first time was in 1854, the Elgin-Marcy Reciprocity Treaty, which was ruptured by the First American Civil War. The second time was, of course, the 1989 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and that is now being ruptured by what is effectively a second U.S. Civil War / Cultural Revolution. Two other trade disruptions in our history also ended the same way. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 led to the 1933 Ottawa Agreements, which put Canada back into the European sphere of influence more deeply through British imperial preferences. The 1971 Nixon measures, which put up tariffs on Canada and everybody else, that led to Pierre Trudeau's famous third option pursuit. So going towards Europe in the face of an American blockade is actually traditional for us. Some say that geography is destiny, and because of the trade links. I would beg to differ. Canada's value-added exports to the United States constitute only 15% of our GDP, and about more than half of that consists of basic commodities, which we sell on the spot market into the U.S. because they need it and want it. This includes potash, oil and gas in the Midwest, includes even aluminum and softwood lumber over the tariffs because the Americans don't have enough of that. We don't need economic diplomacy to sell that. We will continue to sell that. That leaves us only about 7.5% of our GDP that is really at risk, and that's the manufacturing sector. The most important manufacturing sector, the autos, has already actually been decided. The Japanese firms now already account for 77% of Canada's auto production. Stellantis just sold for $100, wrote down $100 billion in proposed investment in electric vehicles in Waterloo, and they shifted their Brampton cheap compass plant to the United States, where they're going to invest $13 billion. So that's happened. That's not anymore destiny, it is history. Moreover, with the digital transformation, geography definitely is not destiny. Is our future poorer without the United States or with a diminished relationship to the United States? If we properly reflect the value of our social system, of our social contract in our GDP measure, we live 6 years longer on average than the Americans, and that's delivered by the quality of our public services. If we capitalize that, we find that we have actually the same per capita GDP as the U.S., and I'm prepared to defend that. And finally, geopolitically, no one ever benefited from being in someone's sphere of influence. We escaped the Monroe Doctrine zone because we were part of a bigger empire, the British Empire. Our path to escaping being part of the Monroe zone, Doctrine zone, is to actually reforge stronger ties with Europe.
Thank you.
Can I stand?
Of course you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to jump down here since we don't have mics. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fine.
Okay.
All right, Patricia Goff, 3 minutes.
Okay. Canada's future is not with Europe. Canada's future is with the world. Europe is going to be a part of that, but it is not going to be the central pillar. Let me give you 3 reasons why. First, our trade reality. It's true. Roughly 70% of our exports go to the United States. Yes, we need to reduce that dependence, but Europe is not the solution. Prime Minister Carney has introduced what he's called his bold plan to diversify our trade. Even with that bold plan, he wants to reduce the quantity of exports that go to the United States to 50% in 10 years. What does that tell us? The U.S. will always be our major trading partner. That's just a fact. We have tried the European option. 8 years after signing CETA, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, we still only have approximately 8% of our exports going to Europe. What does that tell us? That tells us that the evidence is clear. Europe has not delivered on the trade diversification strategy that we need. Second point, romanticism versus reality. We like to say that we share values, we share history with the Europeans. There's some sort of affinity there, fine, that may be true. But if that bond is so strong, why have 10 of 27 EU members still not ratified CETA, our trade agreement? Why is that? Why? Are they concerned about liberalizing trade with Canada? What about the Security Action for Europe program, or SAFE? Canada will participate in that defense procurement program. Awesome, that's great. But why do we have to pay a fee to do so? We've got to pay a fee to do so. There's a reason. The answer is that we are not European insiders. That's a fact. We should be clear-eyed about that. Haven't we learned the lesson about so-called special relationships? Our strategy must be strategic and not sentimental. Okay, finally, future growth. The fastest growing parts of the global economy are not in Europe. They are in Asia, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and beyond. Europe has slower growth, an aging population, and very high regulatory barriers. If Canada is serious about long-term growth, diversification, and economic independence, we need to look where growth is happening and where demand is rising, and not where we feel most comfortable. So Europe will be a partner, but Canada's future is global.
Thank you. All right, proposition side, Dr. Ken Jackson.
I might as
3
well
minutes.
stand up as well. So it's interesting, the way the proposition is phrased, I don't think I'm actually very far from where Patty got to. Canada's future is with Europe. As Mark Carney said in his speech at Davos, allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. Europe is one of those diversification partners. They're not the only one, but they clearly have to be one of them. A world in which Europe is not a core constituent of where Canada looks to trade is a poorer world than we're looking for, okay? The US is going to be the core partner. They're beside us and they're enormous. That's true for us, it's true for Mexico. To be honest, it's probably true for the UK as well, okay? And they're a lot closer to Europe, okay? One of the things that I talk about a lot when I teach about trade theory is we have to remember that trade is not something countries do, trade is something people do, okay? Canada does not trade with Europe. Canadian companies sell to Europe, Canadians buy stuff from Europe. We've been trying to diversify for a decade, but diversification, actual trade diversification, isn't going to happen until companies know they want to reinvest and reproduce to sell towards Europe. One of the challenges that's been ongoing, and I don't think is going to change quickly, is the time horizon of the current uncertainty is shorter than the reinvestment process. It is not worth it for companies to reinvest in a supply chain to go to Europe if they think the world's going to change in 3 years. If you think the world's going to change in 3 years, you sit on the sidelines and do nothing, which is what everybody is doing right now. Okay? So that time horizon piece is incredibly important, just thinking about, okay, how has Canada shifted because of the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement? Not really, but it's almost too soon to tell. Okay? And then the third point is, in Mark Carney's speech, he actually talked about a coalition of countries. You can sort of think of it as a new coalition of the willing, where countries that want free trade are going to be active. Canada has free trade agreements with essentially all of Europe, at least in force, if not signed. We have free trade agreements effectively with Japan through the Trans-Pacific Partnership with South Korea. We are going to have free trade agreements with as many countries as will talk to us. Okay, and Canada needs to do that. But Europe and Canada are going to form a central piece of that, okay? Or at least from Canada's perspective, Europe will form a central piece of that. Because if we don't have free trade with Europe, the whole system breaks down entirely. So when I say Canada's future belongs with Europe, it's mostly that a world in which Canada and Europe are not on the same side is a much poorer world.
Thank you. All right. Finally, Dr. David Welch, 3 minutes.
Thank you. I will maintain the tradition of the tight ends sitting. My colleagues have been discussing economics. Obviously, the economic dimension of the resolution is an important one. I want to talk about 3 non-economic dimensions. I want to speak about governance, security, and affective attachment or identity. With respect to governance, I think when people entertain the thought that Canada's future is with Europe, what they probably have in mind is that at some point Canada will become a fully integrated member of the European Union. That is the universal aspiration for countries, for example, in the former post-Soviet space, who would like to become more European. This idea has been floated. It has not been seriously entertained because there is simply no practical possibility that Canada would be welcome in the European Union or even that Canada would seek to join the European Union. Simply not a topic of conversation. So the idea that something that is not a topic of conversation could predict Canada's future strikes me as highly unusual. Second point, security. Canada's past is with Europe on the security file. All of our formal alliance commitments are with a European country or the United States. We are a founding member of NATO. NATO has been very important to our security portfolio, and it will probably, I hope, continue to be important. So our past has been with Europe on the security front. Our future will probably significantly still be with Europe on the security front. How about the future? Well, that may depend on whether NATO survives Donald Trump or a post-Donald Trump MAGA movement if the United States continues to spin down the authoritarian fascist sewer. So maybe NATO will survive, maybe it will not, but it is very hard to think that NATO will become even more important to Canada than it has been all along. Finally, affective attachment or identity. Let me ask for a quick show of hands. How many of you were born somewhere other than in Canada? How many of you were born in Europe? 2. How many of you were born in somewhere other than Europe? Yeah, point well taken, I think. Since 1980, the 10 largest sources of immigrants to Canada have been in Asia. Small numbers of European countries have occasionally cracked the top 10 list. In the past 20 years, by far the largest sources of immigration to Canada have been India, China, and the Philippines. That looks like a stable, durable trend. The patterns, should they continue, and there's no reason to think they won't, predict that as Canada moves forward, it will become increasingly tied to Asia. That is very likely where people's sentiments will be, where people's family members will be, where their connections will be, and it stands to reason that Canada is simply going to care much more in the future about Asia than it's going to care about Europe when it comes to affective attachment and identity. So Asia will be a bigger part of our domestic politics, as well as our international politics, as well as our economics.
Thank you, Dr. Welch. Much appreciated. That is our first round of opening speeches. We will now move to rebuttals, which will be 5 minutes long instead of 3 minutes long. We'll cycle through our speakers. Again, I see more people have joined us. Thank you for being with us. Again, we apologize for the microphone situation. We are trying our best to project in this space. All right, feel free, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jordan. So first, there is a security dimension and an economic dimension. In the security dimension, there is no possibility of Canada becoming a security partner of India or China, the two big immigration sources. So that's just a non-starter. With the Americans, we have to maintain a very careful balance of protecting their northern flank, not constituting any kind of a threat to them, and given their relationship, adversarial relationship with China, that means that we have to watch very carefully how we deal with China. We don't have to do anything stupid with China, as we did by arresting Meng Wanzhou, or by putting up 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, but we can play under WTO rules with China. Just be careful. So on the security front, what we now see is that we ourselves are under threat from the United States, and so is Europe. So this puts a completely new spin or a lens on how we have to view our security going forward. The only parties with which we have fought and will likely fight in the future, whether it's in Ukraine or somewhere else, it's going to be with the Europeans. So we have to solidify that particular relationship, and that starts with the economics. In terms of how far this goes, that's an interesting question. It could go towards something like, for example, the EFTA relationship, the European Free Trade Area Association with the European Union, and that would be quite some gain. If you look at the cost to Britain of Brexit, that's about 5% of GDP. A deeper relationship with an economic region, the size and scale of Europe, would actually work very greatly in our favor, much more so than a fairly shallow free trade agreement. Whether that's possible in the near future may actually be determined by the degree of hostility coming from the United States. That changes everything. So I think that we can't go by the past, the near-term past, in terms of where and how far we can go with Europe. I think those are the two main points I would make. Yeah, so I'll leave it to my fellow panelists to continue.
Sure. Thank you. All right.
Okay. I'm
Opposition
gonna hop
side.
down again just a this thing. So I'm gonna. Oh, tell me when I'm stuck.
Go ahead.
I'm going to mostly stay on the economic, but I just want to make one security point, which is that Europe is not an alternative to the United States in security terms, because Europe is also under the American security umbrella. So it's not an alternative to the United States. We are all under the same U.S. security umbrella. But on the economic side, I'm going to stay on the economic side for a moment and make 2 points, just to reinforce some of the points that I was making earlier about the fact that, yes, Europe will be a partner and a very important one, but it cannot be, our future cannot be with Europe. Our future has to be global, with Europe as a part of that puzzle. 2 points I want to make. One, Professor Jackson said that it's not countries that trade, it's individuals that trade. I'd like to add another layer to that. It's not countries that trade, not necessarily individuals that trade, it's sectors that trade. And I think as we're thinking about our economic relationship with Europe, we have to think of distinct sectors and think sectorally. One entity that does think sectorally is Export Development Canada. Many of you will know this agency, which helps our exporters to find markets for their products. Export Development Canada, as part of our trade diversification strategy in recent months, has identified 5 high potential sectors that they would recommend would probably be most promising for diversification purposes in the near term. And what EDC did was match them with where the demand for those products actually is. Let me give you a couple of examples. Minerals and ores, you won't be surprised to learn, is a high potential sector. EDC identified 11 possible markets for diversification of minerals and ores. It includes France and Spain, but Mexico, South Korea, Turkey, Colombia. Agri-food, many of you know that agri-food is a very high potential sector for Canada as we're diversifying. EDC identified 9 short-term promising markets. UK and Poland, there are European destinations, but Singapore, India, Turkey, one more, aircraft. Aircraft, sure, Italy and Belgium seem to be a good market for our aircraft, but the key markets that EDC identified, Japan, India, Malaysia, the UAE. So my point here is that when you think sectorally, the pattern is clear. Canada's future is not with Europe. Europe is a part of the puzzle, but Canada's future is global when we think sectorally. And a strong diversification strategy is going to be a strong sectoral strategy. Let me make one more point, because I think I've got a little bit of time, which is also an economic point, thinking about, and I think so much of this discussion has been triggered by the fact that we are dependent on the US market. And so when we think about our future being with Europe, a huge portion of what we're thinking about is, can we pivot to the European market, and how easy will that be? One of the biggest challenges that Canadian exporters face in trying to enter the European market is regulation. We might think this is a thing of the past. Some of you were probably familiar with disputes like hormone beef, and you might have thought, gosh, with CETA, maybe we've dealt with this. Our products can easily enter the EU. They cannot, not all of them. Even today, European regulation erects non-tariff barriers that make it difficult for willing Canadian exporters that want to pivot to enter the European market. Just last month, the Canadian Grains Council released a white paper, and it highlighted these challenges. Canadian grain producers want to export more to Europe, but they are encountering challenges because of the European Union's precautionary principle. It's not that Canadian grains are unsafe. It's that the European Union has a different set of safety standards. And we know that different standards and different regulations function as non-tariff barriers. Grains are not the only sector for whom this has been true. Just last week, the Manitoba Pork Council raised similar concerns, pointing to expensive and time-consuming EU testing on Canadian pork for a disease that Canadian pork has been free of for many years, trichinosis. So the problem isn't that Canadian exporters don't want to sell to Europe. The problem is that Europe often makes it harder than it needs to be. And so as we are thinking, is our economic future with Europe? It can't be. In some sectors, it will be, it might be, but there are many other sectors where we'll have to look globally for those products.
Thank you. All right, now move back to the proposition side. Dr. Jackson, 5 minutes.
I will stay seated this time. On two fronts. One, I think on a combination of the security and economic side, is to think about one of the goals for Canadian politics at the moment, Canadian international economic thought, is how can we avoid making things worse in the short term? And this is one of the places where I think I come back to what Dan was saying, that partnerships with Europe are not offensive to the Americans in any way. We can do almost anything with Europe, and the Americans will say, okay, that's things working more or less as expected. We enter an agreement with China, which looks a lot like agreements the Americans enter into with China, and the Americans start complaining about that. If we enter into agreements with India, the Americans aren't going to be as upset, or not going to be as publicly upset, but they're going to be more concerned. Europe is the safe option as a partner, and I think that will continue to be true. And if you think about options for Canada for the short term, for the next 5 years, I think Europe is the direction to go. Is this going to change the Canadian landscape of trade? Absolutely not. Canadian trade, the US is 75% of our exports. If it's not 60% of our exports in 10 years, I'd be shocked. Okay, the US is our main trade partner. This almost becomes a more philosophical or diplomatic process whereby we're trying to maintain a global order that, as Mark Carney talked about, is breaking down. And the way to maintain that is to have success in maintaining that global order, to have success on signing free trade deals, or extending free trade deals, extending discussions on trade. This is probably an opportunity to talk to the Europeans about safety standards in grain, in pork, and in other things, which the Europeans have always used as trade protection mechanisms. There's no question about that. But I think this is one of the areas where Canada really needs to focus, and it's not about, it's really not about changing the structure of trade. The structure of trade does not change quickly. It's about maintaining a conversation that Canada wants to keep going in the near future while we wait, while everybody around the world waits for the US to hopefully come to their senses at some point. Whether that's 3 years, whether that's 7 years, at some point it's a real problem. And but I think that's step one. The second thing actually on that, on the idea that this is a real problem, one of the things I think is, I think we've overstated the threat to Canadian economic security of these trade barriers. We have moved around this pretty well, okay? Canadian exports fell in the second quarter, and they bounced back a little bit in the third quarter of 2025, and they continue to just float along. The Americans have talked about withdrawing from the Canada, US, Mexico agreement. They haven't actually done anything, and that process is going to continue to get pushed out. And I think what Canada wants to do is maintain all these conversations, so to try and keep pushing those that problem off. Keep pushing that problem off, and wait. And the easiest way to do that is to maintain the conversation with the Europeans, because it's the easiest conversation to have.
Thanks. All right. Go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I will just begin by noting that this is the rebuttal round, and nobody attempted to rebut my point about governance, and nobody attempted to rebut my point about affective attachment. So I guess those could be taken as granted. There have been attempts to rebut my points about security. With respect to security, I would simply ask, where do we see movement? And in what direction do we see that movement? And our ties to Europe on the security side have been very static for decades, not much movement at all. There may be a little movement toward Europe soon. I'm actually rather hopeful that this will happen. We may actually cut a deal with Saab, a new NATO member in Sweden, to build the Gripen fighter in Canada, and to build also a Canadian version of a Canadian surveillance plane in Canada. That will bring, by some estimates, as many as 15,000 jobs to Canada at last count. So there may be a little movement in the European direction on the security side. Almost all of the other movement Canada has made on the security side has been toward Asia. We have now an Indo-Pacific strategy that's brand new. We do not have a new European security strategy. We have new military agreements with, for example, Japan and the Philippines, including cross-servicing and access agreements, information sharing agreements. There is movement in the direction of Canada becoming more active in Asian security. The Canadian Navy now deploys fully a third of its surface warships in East Asia on a regular basis via rotation. We now have more ships deployed for the first time in our history on Vancouver Island at Nanaimo than we do on the Atlantic seaboard in Halifax. This is a clear and strong trend. Canada is about to buy as many as 12 submarines. The favored submarine actually is not in the final running, the Japanese Ciuriak class submarine, quite simply because Japan's order book is full and they have no more capacity to build any submarines for Canada because they're busy building them for Japan. One of the finalists is Korean and one is a German-Norwegian co-production. The betting money, as far as I understand it from Ottawa, is that the Korean submarine has a slight advantage, and that if it does not win the contract, it will be because of nostalgic ties to NATO and not because of the merits of the alternative. So we may find ourselves suddenly buying a major Korean naval vessel. All of the direction of movement is in the direction of Asia. I don't think that'll change because Asia is, as Patty said, the future engine of the global economy. It's going to be important for the world, and therefore it's going to be more important for Canada. It's also the home to some of the most serious flashpoints in the world. The Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea. Canada is very concerned about all of these flashpoints and is doing what we can with our limited capacities to contribute to stability in all of those areas. I would note, for example, that the Royal Canadian Navy has performed more Taiwan Strait transits than has the Japanese Navy. So we are active, and we are becoming more active, and this is deliberate and it's calculated, and by the way, it's very much appreciated by the countries in the region. We may or may not have some sort of security arrangement with India at some point. I personally wouldn't write it out. I think that's not absurd to imagine. China, yes, it would be absurd to imagine that we have any interesting hard security commitments to China, but it's not hard to imagine that we might wind up having some security commitment to Taiwan. So we shall see how this goes. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future. But most people would agree that the clear trends are in the direction of Asia and not Europe.
Thank you, Dr. Welch. And thank you to all of our debaters for those speeches. It's much appreciated. We're going to put up on the screen just shortly a question link, so a QR code there. You can submit your questions for our debaters at that link. Send them in and we'll read them out from the front. Alternatively, we'll have a time where you can just put up your hand and ask a question and they will respond. First, I have a few questions that I've prepared in advance, so we'll ask those, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Awesome. Okay, so I want to begin by reflecting on the nationalist wave of sentiment that has happened in Canada. I can't think of another time where people have been more proud to be Canadian. I'm only 20 years old, so it's not that long, but it's been a significant change. And along with that comes the sentiment of buy Canadian, buy local. And something that I want to ask to both sides is that, do you think this is like a helpful development, or how does it fit into the picture of global trade? Does buying local or buying Canadian help in any sense? And in terms of our global trade, we've relied a lot on the States to be our trading partner. Should we be focusing more internally, just in general? Is that a viable strategy? So I'll start maybe with the proposition side. If anyone wants to comment, then we'll go that way.
Sure. Before the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, half of Canada's trade was actually internal trade, and that shrank considerably following the Free Trade Agreement. The level of tariffs and trade costs that have been imposed by the Trump administration is probably on the order of 10-15% if you count the tariffs plus the additional costs of meeting rules of origin, the certification, et cetera, the new China value content rules that require you to file. One exporter told me that they had 4 times the number of tariff codes in their shipment to the States this year than they had previously, because of the need to verify that nothing was tainted by China, okay? So these costs are very large. There's hysteresis, trade continues to flow initially, but then it falls off. And if you take a look at the Chinese exports to the US, initially they held up and then they fell off a cliff. And where will a lot of that trade go? It will go to internal, to Canada. Canada still is its own best market. If you look at it in terms of shipments, which is sales by Canadian firms to other Canadians, 90% of our sales are to each other. That's a lot of double counting there, because you have firms selling inputs to other producing firms. But we sell primarily to ourselves. So a buy Canadian mode, which will tie in to the blockade that's now emerging on the U.S. border, will definitely increase. But I would also, in terms of spinning this a little bit into the sphere of the area of the debate, right? Canada Historically, the way that the trade system evolved was an axis between the European Union, and the United States. They went into the green rooms in Geneva and they organized the world system. Right now, the axis that's forming, okay, maybe that's not a good word to use, is actually the European Union and the CPTPP. It's a small open economy caucus. And these are the countries that depend on trade. China can be self-sufficient, the US can be self-sufficient, India can be self-sufficient, but the small, open, advanced economies must trade with each other, and therefore the future of the world organization, of the World Trade Organization, or some part of it, will be by virtue of Canada and the EU as central players.
Thanks, Dan. Would you like to comment, Dr. Jackson?
The only thing I'll add to that, on the buy local campaign, I think the biggest effect of buy local campaigns is political, because consumer campaigns to boycott it's specific brands, it's specific products that are coming from the States, push pressure on the politicians from those specific spaces to go then talk to the US administration. And I think that buy local campaigns are shifting the landscape of global trade? I don't. I think companies buying inputs from other companies have much longer supply chains to worry about than that. But at the consumer end, it's putting pressure on specific politicians. And so I don't think they're useless. I don't think they're not economically important as much as they are politically important.
Thanks for that. Dr. Goff.
So I'd add a couple of things. On the Buy Canadian, so I think Dan interpreted it maybe as internal trade within Canada, which is a really interesting way to interpret it. I interpret it as a consumer choice to buy Canadian products. And both are super important to this conversation. So, obviously, lowering our internal trade barriers would be good. It would be better for some provinces than others because, again, we're a regionalized country with, sort of specific sectors. And so the degree to which we lower our barriers, and we can never get rid of them fully, will be, I think, particularly beneficial in the Atlantic provinces and would have smaller impacts in other regions of the country, but positive impact nonetheless. Buy Canadian to me is very complicated because I take Ken's point that, okay, we stop buying bourbon, the message gets sent to Kentucky, and maybe maybe politicians from Kentucky will express their displeasure about that. And that can be useful. But Buy Canadian is also complicated because of how fully integrated our supply chains are. We don't have to drive very, very far to find a Lay's potato chip factory in the region, to find Heinz ketchup, to find other American products where our family members and our friends are working. And so Buy Canadian, which implies don't buy American, can actually harm local workers in ways that we don't want to have happen. So the Buy Canadian in some very clear instances, don't travel to the United States, that's easy. Don't buy bourbon, that's easy. But in other instances, it can be very complicated. Craft is another one that has a great presence in the province of Ontario. So Buy Canadian is complicated, but there's some potential there if used strategically.
Thanks for commenting. Dr. Welch, any comments?
I'm not an economist, so I'll just say that Buy Canadian feels great.
That's right.
That's an awesome response. Okay. I'd like to flip it over to our proposition side. I have a couple questions. I want to start with a logistics question, which is just simply, the States is really close to us. We share a border. Europe, not so much. How do you make that work? Is that a barrier in today's world?
Well, if I start with that border, Canada has got an economy that's about, 7,000 kilometers long and about a few hundred kilometers deep. It's all along the U.S. border. So a border barrier is really not very good for us in terms of geographically, right? But that said, Canada came into being by virtue of not being American. And one of the first nation building projects was actually the Trans-Canada Railroad. And Canada has done nation building before to stitch itself together. If there is, at the University of Alberta, a project on the Northern Corridor. And this has been going for some 10 years. It's been studied by the Senate of Canada. It's not shovel ready, but it does highlight the fact that to integrate the northern part of Canada into the economy, If we build this, we will shrink the country east-west and bring it much more together. And that is going to be critical for us in terms of exploiting our own internal market. We are our own best customers, but we can do a lot by building that east-west infrastructure, whether it's pipelines, transportation, communication. And here I would also, just to kind of bring it back to the European element, okay, is the web, the sovereign digital space. The parties that what we need to do in order to benefit from the digital economy is to actually capture the sovereign web. Since the data-driven economy started in 2010, we lost about 0.32% of global GDP outside of China. That doesn't sound like a big figure, but for Canada, that's a lot. In fact, it's 13% of our GDP. Why did we shrink? Because the American platform firms captured the data rents. They captured all the data. We don't have a sovereign cloud. The Europeans have realized this, and they are the ones which are going to have the critical mass in building a sovereign cloud. And with the Europeans, we will be on the same side in seeking to claw back and capture the value of our data and have a sovereign cloud which is not susceptible to interference, to the diktat from Washington. We found out that Microsoft, for example, testifying in France, said if they were told to turn over French people's data to the U.S. government authorities, they would do so, and they would do that to ourselves. So the sovereign cloud, as part of the infrastructure that we need to develop, is critical, and our partner there will be Europe.
Thank you. Dr. Jackson, as an economist, maybe you can comment specifically on the geographic element of this and like companies trading. Is it a problem that geographic distance, or is that really not consequential?
Geographic distance is a problem. I mean, there's a large fraction of our exports that are in the services side, which consulting firms and engineering firms and such, that travels quite well. I will note that the travel concern to Europe is not as big as the travel concern to Asia. But I do think actually the short distance to the US has always been a critical feature. And I actually think it's the biggest challenge in trade diversification is there is no company sitting anywhere thinking, I want to go to Europe, or none, but very few. I want to go to Europe, or I want to go to Asia. I want to sell to the U.S. I want to get back to normal. And as I said before, the time horizon is short, so you can't retool a factory, find new customers, and then think, well, now I'm going back to the U.S. because they've come back to their senses. So I think that the border is a massive challenge, but the border is the challenge. If the border is high. And there's economic papers that use that metaphor. If there's a big wall at the border preventing our products from going to the U.S., where else are we going to sell them? And in some ways, Europe is easier. In some ways, it's harder. I agree with the other side that the markets in Asia are growing faster. The markets in Asia have also not been friendly places for Canadian exports, for the most part. Commodities, yes. But in general, consumer products, a significant fraction of our output is in the consumer market space, which has not been the direction of Asia. It's been to some extent the direction of Europe.
Yep. Thank you. I'd like to hop over to the opposition now. I think what's on a lot of our minds is the security threat to Canada. When we think of America now, we think of the American flag pasted on top of a map of Canada, and we feel that threat that we haven't even thought was possible. These security concerns, are they not fundamental? Do they not undermine our relationship, even if not economically, relationally? Is that not a concern? And how do you propose we get over this, right? Is this something that stops in 3 years, or if J.D. Vance is elected again, does this just keep going? How do we mend our relationship? Yeah.
So that's a big question. There's a lot there. I personally, in full disclosure, I'm a dual citizen. I lived in the United States for 23 years. I don't believe for a minute that this is going to stop when Donald Trump leaves office. I think what we are witnessing is a fundamental shift in the United States, not a fundamental shift even solely in the Republican Party. I think we are seeing a shift in the United States. And so if I were chatting with any of our politicians, I would suggest that they prepare for the long term, that this is not going to snap back in 3 years, even if the Democrats come into office. I mean, there was some continuity on trade policy, as many of you know, between the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the second Trump administration. You know, a lot of the trade policies remain the same. We can go into that in greater detail if you wish. So point one for me is that this is a fundamental shift, and we need to address it as such. That being said, I'm not worried about a security threat where the United States invades Canada. I think that we spend a lot of time with a lot of the sort of the hair on fire issues that are lobbed out for rhetorical purposes, as opposed to watching the fundamental policy shifts that are taking place and the shifts that are not taking place. Some of you might have noticed in the news today, very quietly, Donald Trump signed probably an executive order. I forgot to check what kind of sort of an instrument it was, restoring U.S. funding to international organizations except the WHO. He doesn't like the WHO. That's interesting. You know, I think if we listen to the statements about international organizations, we get very nervous, the multilateralists on the panel. But if we look at the specific policies that are actually being implemented or walked back after certain rhetorical flourishes, I think those are the tea leaves that I want to follow personally, and that I think will tell the tale. Now, are we still seeing a fundamental shift? Are we still having our, as you say, sort of relational change? Yes, it's different. But I'm not sure it is of the magnitude that some of the very strong rhetorical flourishes would suggest.
Yeah. Dr. Welch, any comments?
Yeah, for the record, I was born in the United States. I am no longer a dual citizen. I gave up my U.S. citizenship in 2017, and I'm feeling pretty good about that right now. I think it is temporary. I think it will go back to normal. It will take a while to get fully back to normal, but I think the fundamentals are very sound in the U.S.-Canadian relationship. I think they're sound economically. I think they're sound politically. And I think they're sound on a person-to-person level. Americans still, generally speaking, have a positive understanding of Canada and Canadians. Small number of vocal people don't, and they've been inflamed by Donald Trump. But I don't think there's any serious movement in the Republican Party to fully embrace long-term hostile relationship with Canada, and I'm very confident that there's no such feeling in the Democratic Party. The thing you have to bear in mind is that the United States has a long history of periodically going temporarily insane. They did this in the Salem witch hunts. It happened in the 1850s. It happened with Prohibition. It happened with the McCarthy era. The Trumpist MAGA movement is just the latest bout of temporary insanity. I think they will come back to their senses.
Thank you, Dr. Welch. I'd like to ask one more question to the proposition side. This goes back to regulations in Europe. Europe is notorious for having, lots of regulations. And I want to specifically ask this question in the context of the tech sector and innovation. We see innovation happening in China and in America primarily. And what I'm referring to is artificial intelligence technology that's driving the markets right now. So how does a future that is with Europe still maintain innovation or grow in innovation in such a highly regulated context? Any thoughts?
A very straightforward one. There are two data states in the world. One is the United States and one is China. China managed to become a data state, to develop the data infrastructure, to develop its platform firms, Tencent, Baidu, etc., because they had the firewall, the golden shield. outside of that world, the US platforms expanded to cover the whole world. Facebook had more clients, 2.5 billion clients, more clients than the population of Europe, US, and China together. Okay, these firms scaled at the global level. Because we were open, our data was captured. And when your data is captured, you can't develop competitors. This is a winner-take-all world. Now, why Europe? Because the Europeans have figured that out finally. We sleptwalk through, the data-driven economy started around 2010, okay? And we sleptwalked through that. People didn't even start talking about that until around 2016, 2019 at the political level. But now they're aware, and they are, Google the number of times you see sovereign cloud in European discussions. They're going to move on it. They have to move on it for security reasons, and we have to move on it for security reasons. And once we have a sovereign cloud, we will have actually the ability to possibly participate in this new economy. That's one answer. The second answer, Jordan, is very simple. The first part of the data-driven economy, 2010 to 2022, was actually AI, so it was data plus predictive AI, okay? Since ChatGPT dropped on November 30th, 2022, we've moved into big data plus generative and agentic AI. And generative and agentic AI is being developed by hundreds of thousands of firms. My own firm, we bought an NVIDIA Spark AI computer because I figured AI was going to replace me, so I wanted to own the AI that replaced me. There's hundreds of thousands of firms, millions of firms developing. The chances are that we will have a very different looking world, not the winner-take-all world of the first part of the data-driven economy. And that world will be one in which AI regulation will be of great concern, and we will share the same perspective on it as Europe.
Thanks. Dr. Jackson?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think one of the things that, I've said this before in other spaces, but the social media period, which is still going on, but is winner take all, and first to market is really important. I don't see that on the generative AI side. The generative AI side, there's actually quite a bit of research on the lack of patent protection behind generative AI. It's not obvious that being first is going to be best. And so the question of whether you can sit back and watch the Chinese and the Americans fight it out with hundreds of billions of dollars being spent, and then say, okay, we can copy this part. Because to be honest, the technology behind generative AI is in some ways not that special. There's a lot of money going into it. The other side of this is, I am of the opinion that there's an economic bubble sitting here with the generative AI companies that is going to collapse. When it's going to collapse, that's the point of bubbles. Like, they're almost impossible to predict. But the idea that current investment dollars flowing into the U.S., the Bank of Canada came out with their monetary policy report a couple weeks ago, and the only thing driving the U.S. economy, there's a bit on the consumer side, and there's the AI investment side. If the AI investment side collapses, like that piece of the U.S. puzzle just drops out of nowhere. There's not a lot of other investment going on. One of the pieces, there's been all this talk about the tariffs are intended to draw reinvestment into the U.S. None of it is happening, other than the AI side. Okay, Apple keeps promising an extra $100 billion every time they go in the media. They're not actually doing anything. They're just sort of sitting there waiting. They keep on pushing back each building that they're supposed to build because they don't know what's going to happen next. And so I do think on the AI side, it's not obvious. So we want to be involved. We want students. I want students learning how the generative AI side works. I want us to develop that side of expertise, but being first to market, I just don't see as an advantage in this one.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments. So now we're going to move into question period from all of you. As you can see on the screen, there is the QR code. If you haven't scanned that and submitted your question, please do. We will also open up the floor for verbal questions. I'm going to read a question that we've received through our system there, and then I'll take a couple audience questions live. So this is something we just received. Our current system is more integrated with the European system, not with Asia. If the US imposed sudden tariffs on Canadian critical exports, which combination of trade diversification, domestic industrial policy, and CUSMA dispute mechanisms could Canada use to minimize shock? Due to the urgency of our current situation, would trading with Europe make more economic sense rather than Asia? We'll start on this side and move over that way.
I think in terms of if there are shocks, tariff shocks, the world rearranges itself naturally. For example, to give you the, let's take the auto sector, okay? We sell about, we export 45 billion or so automotive to the US. The US exports about 45 billion or so to us. When tariffs go up by the Americans, we put up tariffs as well to protect. What happens is it becomes a lot more attractive to ship east and west. So that trade falls, but it's replaced automatically by east-west trade in Canada. And of course with third parties as well. So every sector will be different. If there's the tariffs go up on critical minerals, they won't go up on critical minerals. The Americans want that. What are they going to actually tariff? I mean, most of the stuff doesn't make any sense, but if they do, and aluminum is one of them, for example, what happened? When they put up aluminum tariffs, the first few months, Canadian exports fell while the American aluminum users used up their inventory. Then the prices rose 250% to cover the tariff, and our exports continued because they don't have an alternative. The world will rearrange. I wouldn't worry about that, actually.
Awesome. Any thoughts?
I think the notion of trade rearranging to short-term shocks, I think is not going to happen. The idea of CUSMA dispute mechanisms happening to fix short-term shocks and actually working in the short term is also not going to happen because you need the US to agree to participate in those. No, I think that the response to short-term shocks in Canada is Canadian economic policy around employment insurance and then is internal trade, and then the government stepping in with short-term safety net that we have. Trade diversification is a long-run strategy, not a short-run strategy.
Any thoughts on this side?
So I appreciate the person asking, raising those three things. If I remember, it's CUSMA, industrial policy, and diversification as the three possible kind of arrows in the quiver of the Canadian government. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting question. We haven't said much about industrial policy narrowly or sort of broader domestic development of Canadian industry, and that, clearly is where a lot of the action is. I mean, these three things are going to move together. CUSMA has protected us in this period because, with the exception of automobiles, aluminum, some very critical sectors that are suffering, and I don't want to minimize the impact on those sectors, CUSMA has protected us in the sense that CUSMA compliant goods are still going into the United States tariff-free. So it's not CUSMA dispute settlement, but it's the agreement itself. And so continuing that would be really helpful. Diversification can help, but as my colleagues have said, that's a long-term strategy. Industrial policy is also a long-term strategy, and probably the one that requires most thought from Canadians. I mean, to the degree that we should be having a kind of a national conversation about where things are going, that's probably where we need to be focusing our attention. And if I may, it kind of goes back to a distinction that Ken Jackson made earlier between goods and services, which I think is an important one. If you look at some of the major projects that the current government has put forward, we understand why they're choosing these projects, but they're very much on the good side of the bargain. And thinking about sort of the services, the digital, some of the economy of the future side of the ledger, maybe those are still to come. And so that industrial policy conversation is a really interesting one to me. Where should the government be developing our domestic economy? Where are we putting our resources to develop it now, and where should we be putting it in the future?
Thanks. Dr. Welch, any thoughts?
So I don't mean to go off script here, but we're in the presence of three really smart economists. So I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah.
There's been some talk recently about the decline of the American dollar as the world's dominant currency. Do you see any prospect of the euro taking on that role?
I don't. This is the challenge. People have talked about the decline of the American dollar. I actually don't see that happening for the simple fact that there is no alternative to the American dollar. If there's an alternative, I think it is the euro. It's not going to be.
Not BRICS.
That's not a currency at the moment. And China is not giving up control of their own currency to a multinational
Would have to be
organization. It is not going to. I don't. It's not going to be a Chinese currency is going to become the global currency, because I don't think people will trust a Chinese currency at the moment. I think the euro is the logical contender, but I don't see the euro replacing the U.S. dollar.
What limits it?
I think, I mean, the growth, the limited growth potential in Europe, in my position, is the limiting factor for the euro. It's, I mean, it's a challenge to this conversation. I fully accept, but I do think that's the limiting factor to the euro. I think the U.S. talks about trying to be. They sort of talk out on both sides. We want to be the dominant currency, but we also want a weaker currency at the same time. I don't think they actually. I think they're quite happy with their dominant currency location.
You sound like you have something
So
to say.
I kind of I take a very different perspective on this. The U.S. dollar is the international vehicle currency, not because of the American fiat, but because it was adopted by anyone can use any currency they want. It just happens that there are like 150 currencies in the world, so there's like 150 times 149 divided by 2 exchange rates. It's a lot of exchange rates, and if everyone goes through the dollar to go from, say, Brazilian real to Mongolian dinars, whatever it is, okay, then it's a lot cheaper and more efficient. But that's a case of these dollar markets exist. They can easily be formed with any other currency. China has long been developing the infrastructure to go international. It needs to do two things. First of all, it's already got the China International Payment System in place. This executes trades in seconds and costs a cup of coffee, compared to SWIFT, which takes days and costs quite a bit as a percentage of the face value of the currency. So they've already got the payment system in place. What they need is to float maybe $1 trillion worth $1 trillion worth of international bonds to create the liquidity that people can use. I think the path forward for the world actually will be a combination of the US dollar and the China forming a peg, which then stabilizes those two currencies, with China appreciating its currency as it has to in this scenario. And then China will share the exorbitant privilege, and it will share the exorbitant burden, which is the American take on the role of the dollar playing that international role and causing over-evaluation of the U.S. dollar and eroding the competitiveness of its manufacturing sector. A U.S.-China détente could actually create that. I don't see the euro forming that, but in point of fact, the world could adopt the euro. There is a float of euro bonds out there, and it could work.
Thanks for your thoughts. I actually want to go back to Dr. Welch. You talked about the states periodically just going crazy for a bit, and that just like keeps happening in cycles. How often and frequent would that have to happen in order to make it worth it to move away from the states, say towards Europe? Like, what's the threshold?
That's a very good question. It's probably a longer timeline than the political calculus of any politician, because electoral cycles are much shorter than that kind of major realignment. So it's hard for me to imagine that anybody would even have the foresight to try to make moves in the direction of that kind of adjustment. But I don't actually think the Americans do go crazy that long. They are relatively brief. They're periods of years, and not longer than periods of years. And it's a storm you can ride out.
Yeah. Thanks. I'd like to open it up to the audience. If there's anyone who has a question on their mind and would like to ask it, now is the time. Mr. Pellegrino.
All right. I submitted this question as well, but basically the essence of it is, so far the discussion is centered around Europe and a little bit on Asia as alternatives. But there's also economies in, for example, South America and in Africa, where some of the largest growing nations are currently, for example, Nigeria. And so I was wondering, basically just more broadly, what your thoughts are on kind of expanding or making ties in those directions.
Yeah, so African, Asian markets, basically the rest of the world, it's not.
Yeah.
Of course.
I'll repeat more briefly.
Yeah.
So far we've talked about Europe and Asia. What about South America? What about Africa?
Okay, regions of the world we have overlooked. What about those? Let's start with this side, and we'll move that way. So, Dr. Welch, any thoughts?
Well, the economists will have more to say. Latin American economies, the economic profile of the continent is fairly stable. It's hard to see how it's going to change dramatically. And to the extent that Canada and Latin America have mutually beneficial economic relations, they're probably pretty maxed out in most respects. I don't know if there's a lot of upside room for growth. Possibly in some agricultural areas. Of course, agriculture, as we know, is something that's always been a sticking point in multilateral trade negotiations. So we're probably doing about as well, I think, with Latin America as we can. There's an enormous amount of upside growth in Africa because it's such a dynamic continent and the population is growing dramatically. That will create challenges and opportunities. The usual complaint about doing business in Africa is that there isn't the reliable governance infrastructure to make contracting easy and reliable. There's kind of a risk premium built in when you have political instability and where you have countries that are very, very vulnerable to climate-related weather shocks. And clearly Africa is going to be impacted significantly by climate change, which will make the costs of doing business in Africa higher because they're less predictable. I think that's mostly what I would flag.
Thanks.
I think that's a really important question. I think there's enormous potential. You may know that the EU just concluded a trade agreement with the Mercosur countries. We are looking at a trade agreement with the Mercosur countries. Africa is a longer term play, right? The 54 of 55 African countries created the African Free Trade Area. A few years ago, the predictions or the projections out to 2050 are that Africa is going to be where it's at. So getting our ducks in a row in anticipation of that would be really smart. The last thing I would say is, again, thinking sectorally, there is always a sector in the Canadian economy that can benefit from opening a region or a country's market. When we signed CPTPP, we didn't necessarily have our eye on every member of the CPTPP. We really had our eye on Japan. That was a big prize, and that was a big prize for certain sectors. And so there's a version of that in Latin America and in Africa also, and I think our government is already looking into these things.
Side table. Yeah.
I think, in the medium term, in the 10 to 20 year horizon, I think I agree with Dr. Welch. The South America, to be honest, we produce a lot of the same stuff, and the trading market has been thin. Africa is growing very quickly, but current trade is very small. And so it could grow significantly every year, and it wouldn't amount to a significant amount of trade diversification for Canada. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. That doesn't mean the benefits of trade, the benefits of a better diplomatic connection, a better economic connection, are more than just $1 billion of trade or $2 billion of trade. And I do think that the connection, especially to Africa, but also to some extent to Latin America, Canada's going to basically ride on the coattails of someone as part of that happens. I think Canada, if to the extent that Europe gets involved in those trade agreements, I think Canada might be able to follow along with some of that. Basically, because we'll be looking for roughly the same things that the Europeans are. we probably share less in common with the things that other countries are looking for. But I think it's important, but we just have to recognize it's a very small starting point.
Yep. Anything you, Dan?
So the problem with trading with Africa is they don't have firms. It's called the missing middle, but it's really the missing firm problem. My first project for Ethiopia, I looked up the number of firms. National Bank of Ethiopia total 1,900 firms. What's the sampling ratio? Well, that was it. 1,900 firms, a country of 100 million. The problem is firms trade. Patty said sectors trade. No, it's firms trade, and larger firms trade. And if you don't have those firms, you just don't get the trade. So you might have measured internal growth in an economy by the IMF, but that's not translating into market access because large firms buy and large firms sell. So we don't have the firm level partners in Africa and we don't have them in South America. And that's why trade is still limited with those parties. But the other thing is that we are moving into a new age of machine knowledge capital, which is going to change the world completely and will change the trading patterns and comparative advantages of everyone completely. So in terms of, we're trying to forecast where we're going to be in 2040. Right now, we can't forecast where we're going to be in 2028 in terms of the impact of AI on our production structure. So I would be careful with that, and I would really emphasize the fact that what we should be doing when we partner with African countries, okay, is that we should emphasize building up firms that can trade, and then forming those partners, and then we will have partners to trade with. It's not the country, it's the firms.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to do one question that we got online here, and this is to the proposition side. It was said that the US wouldn't look that kindly on Canada making a deal with India or other Asian countries. Why would that be when the US has just made a big deal with India itself? How much impact will American retaliation really have, and does it outweigh the potential benefits of increased trade with Asia?
Well, to me, I don't see actually the Americans retaliating for a deal with India, but the deals with India are very, very shallow. India doesn't have very deep trade because they've got very thick borders, and really they've only got one province which is in the 21st century, and that's the one with the tech. Sorry. Anyways, China is the place where the Americans object to. Now, the Americans, of course, have got a phase one deal with China, and they have no problem with that. Donald Trump has no problem with Chinese company, with BYD entering the U.S. market if they build cars in the U.S. He has a problem if Canada has a deal with China, and he has a problem if Chinese EVs enter the Canadian market. So we will face that kind of incoherent noise coming out of the United States on our relationships with India and with China and with others. But the critical part for us, I think, is that with China there is a security dimension. China is an adversary as well as a partner, so it's a frenemy in those terms. And we have to watch the way that we approach and the way that we couch our statements. We're trading with China, we're not necessarily working with China. That's the language we should be avoiding. But yeah, I don't see it actually at the moment as being sort of something which will come down like a ton of bricks on us, but it's just something that damages the atmospherics.
Okay.
I just think I agree. I don't think the U.S. is going to retaliate if we have a trade agreement in some sort with India. As long as Canada needs to be a little careful in how hard it looks like it's pivoting away from the U.S. The U.S. wants to put up a tariff barrier, but also wants us to keep coming back. Yeah. And the harder we look like we're pivoting away, I think keeping the politics low key is important. And a massive trade agreement with India is not low key. A trade agreement with Europe's already in place. We don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Appreciate those comments. Another question from the room, and just for reference, we'll be wrapping up at 6:30 p.m. So, any other questions from the room? Yes.
From what I understand, this forum is dedicated to Canada's potential future trade agreements with Europe and further integration. As some propose, we pivot further away from the U.S. So my question is in regard to that. So given Canada's 2.5 annualized GDP growth in third quarter of 2025, in Europe's 1.2 versus the Americans' 4.4 rate, aren't the overregulation and redistributionist policies shared by the leftist governments in Canada and EU the real drag holding both back? And making deeper European alignment in this case would be simply a recipe for continued underperformance.
Okay, I'll just reiterate for the room here. The structure of European economies, we see like less growth, more regulation, specifically more like left-leaning policies about redistribution. Is that a disadvantage for us? Is that really helpful if we're moving towards Europe? Would anyone like to comment on that?
Well, certainly in my view, that's not the issue. In the data technology space, this was a winner-take-all world, and the U.S. was the first mover. They captured that world. Both Europe and Canada was left in their dust. And it had nothing to do with the fact that we regulate and the Americans don't. It just had to do with first mover. The new world of machine knowledge capital that we're going forward, of AI, is very different. And the issue of regulation will be there and prominent, but both Canada and Europe might be able to participate in that, and regulation will be part of it, but it's not going to be the differentiator of whether or not we can prosper. What will differentiate is whether or not we can actually capture the value of our own data and whether we can build companies on that basis. So I'm agnostic on whether that will be possible, but I don't think it's due to this regulation, and certainly the left-right characterization of regulation, I think, is not a good one to actually use. So Europeans also live longer than Americans by a good measure because they've got a sounder social structure.
Thank you. Does anyone on this side disagree with that or would like to provide any contrasting comments?
I mean, I agree that low growth and high regulation makes the European market a little bit less appealing. It doesn't mean it's unappealing, but in certain sectors it's certainly less appealing.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions in the room? Yes.
I've noticed the proposition has talked about data a couple of times, and I wondered if the opposition had anything to say in response to that.
About if indeed Canada's future would be with Europe, looking through a data lens.
Yes, but sorry to repeat the question. The proposition has talked about data a number of times, and data being the reason why we should go with Europe, and I was wondering if the opposition had anything to say about it.
Yeah. So data security may be higher with Europe, but in terms of like access and that sort of thing, any thoughts?
I mean, this is. Do you have thoughts?
You go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say. I mean, this is Dan's wheelhouse. So, but I will say, when I think about data and what we need to do with data, I think we need to do a lot of work domestically, and I don't think there's a solution for Canada with regard to data that resides with the U.S. or resides with Europe. We're sitting in Waterloo, right? We're just down the road from a lot of the places where a lot of this began, and I think a lot of the debates that have emerged from some of the folks who've been prominent in this town make sense to me. That there are, we don't have the ability necessarily to harness data in the way that we should. Is Europe the answer to that? Is the U.S. the answer? Canada's the answer to that. So I think there's domestic work that we need to do to get our own house in order when it comes to a number of the tech and data issues. But you go.
I think the question of data is really a question about the United States, not really about Europe. Canadians, I think, would like to have a very European-like set of data protections, privacy protections. It's every time we try to do this, the United States goes crazy, and you can't post a news link on your Facebook page because of pushback from the big American companies. So we're sort of stuck in the American data ecosystem. And again, Dan's the expert. He can talk about what it might take to get out of that and how long that might take. But it's really not the case, I think, that Europe is just an easy alternative here.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
We can go across, yep.
Can I say the last two questions? First of all, I want to say GDP growth isn't everything. it's maybe not even the main thing. And on the sorry,
GDPR isn't everything.
And on the regulation point, people seem to forget, like, we're, 17 years removed from a financial crisis that everybody blames on a lack of regulation. And we go back to, okay, but if we had less regulation, we'd grow faster, which is exactly what the Americans said for 15 years before the financial crisis of 2008. I'm not saying we want more regulation. I'm not saying all the American regulation is good, but it's also not completely obvious that the Europeans are wrong on regulation either. It depends on the market. It absolutely depends on the sector. It absolutely depends on the market. We need to be careful, and going back to them, both Dan has written about and Dan has said today, Canadians and the Europeans live longer than the Americans do. And at least part of that is the left-leaning social structures that exist in all those countries. And I don't think we want to give those up.
Yeah, Dan.
So on data, okay, you know that since the data-driven economy came into sort of being, the Americans have insisted upon free flow of data across borders and no data localization. Why? Because their companies were capturing it. Then when China got into the game, all of a sudden the Americans decided, oh, we don't necessarily want to have China getting TikTok getting American data, and they reversed their position. Why is that? Because data is extraordinarily valuable. NVIDIA became a $5 trillion market capitalization company last year, briefly, because data is extraordinarily valuable. We're talking trillions, okay? And it's not a question of privacy, David. It's a question of the value proposition of you. If you capture that data, you can make a huge amount of money. The Magnificent Seven, I write in my new paper, would still be only a 1960s movie if it weren't for data. So the question is how we capture that data. The Americans know the prop value of that. That's why if you try and slap a digital service tax on them, they come down like a ton of bricks on you with massive tariffs. They want that data. If we capture that data, we will also prosper. And there is the question of the sovereign cloud.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to all of our debaters. This has been very enlightening. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. I'd just like to conclude that this is the type of event that the Waterloo Forum does. We'll be running these in the future. We try to run at least one of these large debates every term. So stay tuned for future events. Finally, if you are a student and you maybe haven't eaten yet and you want to talk to any of these debaters more, we're going to be going to Grad House on campus. So if you'd like to stick around and chat with any of these debaters personally, you can. So just stick around if that's you. Thank you everyone for coming.